If you have an interest in horses and love learning more about horses, the horse industry, teaching, or even managing your own horse business, then you're in the right place. We would love you to join us on our mission, which is to improve the lives of horses around the world through the education of riders, handlers, and trainers. So get comfortable, listen in, and enjoy.
This has been another episode sponsored by Online Horse College. If you haven't had a look at the wide variety of equine-specific accredited courses, then go to onlinehorsecollege.com and I'll see you over there. Today we've got a return guest, Dr. Peter Huntington. So for those who know Dr. Peter Huntington, you know that he's a vet who specialises in equine nutrition and is conducting ongoing research and investigation into the nutrition of horses, and he's also a director of the equine nutrition at Kentucky Equine Research. Peter's also written a couple of books, but all those details are on his first chat. If you go to horsechats.com, search for Peter or search for Huntington and you'll find that. He's also done one on 10 tips of basic feeding principles, which is sort of a precursor to this one. Then he's gone on and branched out into 10 tips of feeding performance horses. Now it's a little bit of a different branch today, 10 tips on basics of feeding breeding horses. Peter, how are you today?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Glenys.
Great.
Very good. And this is a topic of significant interest to me, breeding horses. And
Okay.
I work with a lot of the bigger thoroughbred breeding farms, try and get their feeding programs right and get them to have feeding programs with sort of optimum fertility and lower amounts of wastage. But equally, the same principles apply to all sorts of horses.
Okay. So the first tip we've got, you're going to talk about pregnant mare nutrient requirements.
Yeah, well, I think the important thing to remember in feeding the mare is that the requirements are not the same all year round, that they vary according to the stage of pregnancy and or lactation, and that you've probably got about, 3 stages. You've got the feeding of the dry mare or the dry mare and the early pregnant mare, and then the later pregnant mare, and then the lactating mare. And they're all different. So first half of pregnancy, the nutrient requirements are not much different to the horse that's non-pregnant. So you don't need to you don't need to think, oh, my mare's just come back, it's got a positive test, it's 45 days or 45 days pregnant. I've really got to ramp up the feeding. I've really got to, double the amount or pay special attention. Sure, you want to be supplying the right forage to the horse. You want to have the mare in good condition. You don't want her losing weight at this stage because that could, if it's severe enough, imperil the pregnancy. But you just want to maintain normal condition. You certainly don't want them gaining weight too much because there's fat brood mares are not efficient and have increased wastage. So just feed them, much like a dry mare, maintain good condition and feeding a normal balanced diet. When we get to the second half of pregnancy, and particularly in the last sort of third, as it were, you're getting significant growth of the fetus inside the mare, so you need extra energy and protein to supply what the mare is supplying for the growth of that foal, but particularly you need to be concerned about trace minerals, and that's because milk is a relatively poor source of trace minerals like copper or zinc or selenium, and so you're going to feed the mare during pregnancy extra trace minerals so that they can be stored in the foal's liver at foaling and used by the foal until they start eating decent amounts of pasture or hard food. So they're a good source of trace minerals that the foal needs, particularly for developing bone and joints, etc. And so paying particular attention to copper, zinc, selenium nutrition in late pregnancy, in the second half of pregnancy is very important.
Okay. All right. And then you've gone on for number 2, the lactating mare nutrition.
Yeah, when the mare's feeding a foal, they're like a dairy cow. They're producing large amounts of milk, and that requires a lot of energy and protein. Their appetite goes up dramatically. So if you put a mare in a yard, just feed them hay, then you'll see how much hay they'll eat because of the appetite. So high protein needs, high energy needs, high calcium needs. So if you are giving supplementary forage, your choice of would be lucerne hay, and it's the time where you often need to introduce a feed that's designed for broodmares and to start to feed larger amounts. So something that I formulated, designed for broodmares, barrow stock, breed and grow. It may be that depending on the breed of mare, you may only need to feed a couple of kilos of that during pregnancy, but you may need to increase it during lactation, depending on what pasture is there. Now, not all mares need feeding during lactation, because if there's enough pasture, they'll do it on pasture alone. But you need to be aware of considering, how much pasture is there, how much hay am I giving, and therefore how much feed am I going to offer to there to make up the shortfalls.
That comes back to the body condition scoring we're talking about in the first, the basic feeding, wasn't it?
Scoring. Yeah. And if you're trying to get the mare back in foal, you don't want them losing weight. If they're not trying to get back in foal, then they can draw upon their reserves to produce milk. If they lose too much weight, they won't make as much milk and the foal won't grow as fast. So you've got a number of factors to consider there.
Yep. All right, so the first two were about the mares. The third one is feeding the breeding stallion year-round.
Yeah, stallions are... people tend to overcomplicate stallion feeding, and they think that it's much more difficult than it really is. So key thing you want there is that the stallion, and it's going to depend on the number of mares he's covering and activity in the paddock, but if he's in a paddock or might well be locked up in a stable, unfortunately, but they don't need to be fed massive amounts for much of the year. So when they're not covering, as long as they're not running the fence all the time, then often you don't need to feed large amounts of concentrates. During the covering season, maybe you do, depending on the horse's libido, the number of mares he's covering. Often you need to increase it. But the biggest killer of stallions is overfeeding. And it's also the biggest influence on behaviour. The stallions are an unpredictable beast. So we don't want to be overfeeding our stallions. And we don't want to, there are some nutrients that may have an effect, a beneficial effect on fertility in some circumstances, and we want to supply a balanced diet, but we don't need to be sort of feeding them, filling the feed bin full of feed. That won't influence their fertility. In fact, it's more likely to go the other way.
Okay. All right, now tip number 4, we've got impact on body condition, on breeding, fertility and foaling problems. Yeah, well,
keeping the breeding horse in the right sort of body condition is important, just as is with any other horse. But there's a thought in sheep in particular that a thing called flushing is beneficial to fertility, where they get a bit thin during the winter or perhaps during late summer, and then you feed them up, they gain a bit of condition, and that improves fertility. That doesn't happen in horses. So ideally you want to maintain your horse in good body condition all year round. You don't need to say to your mare, I want to get her in foal, so if she's in good condition, I want to make her fat. And in fact, that would be detrimental to the mare. The stallion, the same sort of thing. Ribs, stallions can get mares in foal with their ribs visible. Mares can get in foal with their ribs visible. They don't have to be fat to do it. And in fact, you get more problems with fat mares and fat stallions than you do the other way around. It's better for them to be on the thin side. Okay. On the other hand, you don't want them losing weight. And if they're very thin, then they will be reproductively less efficient.
All right.
They get too fat, you're going to have more foaling problems.
And again, we go back to the 10 tips on basic feeding problem, which is your body condition scoring,
absolutely.
Going back to that. So anyone who's sort of got to this stage and hasn't listened to that first one, they should listen to the first one first and then come back over here. Yeah. All right. Now,
absolutely.
Feeding for safe growing growth in weanlings and yearlings, because you're talking quite a lot about don't overfeed. Yeah. Safe growing growth. Yep.
Yeah. And what here, it's not... when we're raising horses, we're not sort of raising, we're not feeding animals that are being sold by the pound or have to get to a certain weight to go to market at a certain day. We're wanting to raise an athlete. So we're looking at more moderate growth rather than rapid growth. We don't want to feed them to grow as fast as they can, as otherwise we'll just have more problems, more wastage, more skeletal problems. So we're trying to find that sort of optimum growth. And that depends, is your horse something that you want to show as a young horse? Is it a maturity horse? Or are you happy to sort of go, I want to ride it as a 6-year-old, I don't really care how well it doesn't need to look, glossy and shiny as a yearling or a 2-year-old. I'm happy to take it slowly.
Mm-hmm.
So your feeding and your management are going to vary according to those circumstances, but very often you don't need to be feeding large amounts of concentrate feeds to these horses. And one of the things is that when we write feeding instructions on bags of feed for breeding horses, we tend to do them a bit for thoroughbreds. And they've got, different thoroughbreds or perhaps standardbreds. They've got different economic goals. They need to be more mature. They need to grow faster because they're often sold as yearlings or racing as 2-year-olds, etc. And if you've got a warm blood, you don't want to feed them that way because you'll have too many risks of developmental orthopedic disease. They'll get heavy. They grow faster. And so it's finding that right balance and seeking professional advice about the appropriate strategies for feeding your young growing horse are really important.
Yes, and I think the two different types, the race horses that do compete and perform fairly early, whereas the performance horses, you want them to go on and have a longer performance life, start later, have a longer life. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, now the nutrients involved in bone health.
Yeah, bones are a really important area. Bone and joints are one of the key areas of wastage.
Mm-hmm.
So you can have a great looking foal and it's no good if it gets skeletal disease later on. So there we're looking at things like, particularly minerals like calcium, like phosphorus, so having an adequate amount of calcium and phosphorus, and that depends a little bit upon the forage you have. If you have kikuyu pasture, which has got oxalate tie up the calcium, then obviously it's much harder to get that sort of balance right. If you're feeding lucerne, that's a good source of calcium, and you have that available, then it's a fair bit easier. We've got minerals like copper and zinc and manganese. They're involved in various issues around bone development, cartilage development within and maturation within the joint. So they're key nutrients to consider. So about skeletal health and about getting the balance of those nutrients right and making sure, it's the time to feed if you are feeding, you don't just go, I've got a yearling and I'm going to feed a pony feed to it because my horse is, it's in good condition. I'll pick a low energy feed. That's not necessarily the right way to go. Better way to go would be to pick something that's been designed for young growing horses but is fed at a lower rate. And there's a lot more use, I think, a sensible use of what we call balanced pellets that are fed at about, say, half a kilo, 1 kilo a day, where they're a concentrated source of nutrients. They don't have a lot of energy in them. An example of ours is all-phase pellet. There are a number of others around, Barrow-Stock Stud Balancer, and they are very useful ways of feeding the nutrients that are important for bone health without overfeeding energy to a young horse.
Okay, good. Now, the next one we've got, we did talk a little bit about herd feeding in the basic feeding principles, but the feeding and the practical management considerations for herd feeding as far as breeding horses.
Yeah, it's about, generally got groups of horses and you're going to have the effects of pecking order. So thinking about giving each horse access to the feed, be it hay and concentrate feeds. If you've got feed bins out, you want to be feeding off the ground because they get less. You reduce wastage, and certainly if you're in sandy areas, you reduce sand consumption when you've got proper feed bins. Sand can lead to sand colic or diarrhea. Is the number of feed bins and the placement of feed bins. So rather than putting all your feed bins in a line, you better put them in a big circle or a square or something like that. So if the horse at the bottom of the pecking order gets kicked off the feed bin at the one end of the line, it doesn't have to walk all the way around to the other end of the line to get a new feed bin. And it's things like extra feed bins, so giving one extra feed bin per horse. So you've got half a dozen young horses out there, 7 feed bins, that sort of thing. or mares, but more so with mares actually, in terms of pecking order effects. Young horses are not too bad, and they'll often share feed bins, but as colts get a bit older, this time of year, yearling colts are starting to feel the effects of testosterone a bit, and they will start to want to, dominate others in the herd. And feeding time is one of the times of domination, and that can affect the way your feeding program performs.
Sure. All right. The value of vitamin E for breeding stock.
Yeah, I mean, vitamin E is a really important nutrient for all sorts of horses. It's an antioxidant, interacts with selenium a lot. Some of the areas of the country are selenium deficient, southwest of Western Australia, some coastal areas in Victoria and the Hunter Valley are particularly selenium deficient. So both supplementary selenium and vitamin E become more important nutrients in those areas. Mm-hmm. And vitamin E is an antioxidant and that has a role in optimum fertility in both the mare and the stallion. So making sure that your diet has enough vitamin E. And this is particularly relevant when they're in a drought, when you're getting nothing from the forage. So green grass has got good amounts of vitamin E. And so springtime is naturally, with green grass, is naturally a time when the horse will be getting quite a bit of vitamin E from the grass. But when you're feeding hay, particularly last year's hay, or there's nothing on the ground, you're getting nothing from those sources. So thinking about the vitamin E content of the feed you're using, or perhaps as a supplement, are relevant, particularly in the horses that you think are sub-fertile, okay. So stallions or mares. So we tend to think of vitamin E with performance horses mainly, but breeding horses, it deserves some consideration too.
Mm-hmm. All right, now fish oil. Tell us about that and the benefits for that for breeding horses.
You don't need too many supplements in terms of feeding breeding horses, and you want to keep it simple. But fish oil, which is a source of long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, and these have some beneficial effects on both stallion and mare fertility. And they've sort of, in the stallion, they've been shown, and other animals, they've been shown to improve motility of sperm and sometimes sperm numbers. So the subfertile stallion have been shown to have benefits with fish oil supplementation. And, humans are taking fish oil generally for cardiovascular health, or perhaps for, anti-allergic properties or some things like that. So we take it for a variety of reasons, but in the horse, it's a useful supplement for a stallion or in a mare that's subfertile. So mares that are prone to early embryonic loss or prone to placentitis will also benefit from fish oil supplementation. The other area of vitamin E that's interesting is that if you give vitamin E to your mare before foaling, then that's been shown to improve immune transfer to the foal in the colostrum. So improving the health of the foal is consideration.
All right. Now, the number 10 is measures to reduce the risk of DOD. So if you want to explain that a little bit more.
Well, yeah, that could be that's a whole topic in itself, Glenys.
We could get you to come back and,
Yeah, maybe we should do that. is one of a number of conditions. It's a sort of overarching term for a number of conditions that can affect the bones and joints of the young growing horse.
Okay.
It's angular limb deformities, flexural deformities, OCD, cysts, wobbler syndrome, or we'll put particularly collapsed tarsal bones in there in young foals. So there's a number of these conditions that it's thought some sort of nutritional principles have an influence on. And I think if you do feel you've got either a individual horse that's affected, you can put that on a dietary management is one of the things that you can do to improve the chance of recovery. But then you need to look at, okay, what are we going to do differently next time, the next time we breed a horse? And you've got to start with the pregnant mare, and then you've got to look at how you feed the young horse. And I think in summary, it's I've covered a number of these issues earlier, but it's not overfeeding, paying attention to pregnant mare nutrition, particularly in the area of trace minerals, When I get to young horses, it's not pushing them too hard growth-wise and looking to have lower glycemic feeds that supply the right amounts of minerals, and also some areas of vitamin nutrition are also involved in that. Now, we've just developed a new supplement that is aiming to improve bone density, and that's a collection of minerals and vitamins. We've got some data about that improving bone density, and bone health is one of that areas of developmental orthopedic disease. So something breeders are searching for, and we're not going to get right because there are genetic components to it, and then there's environmental considerations and a number of other factors that are involved in developmental orthopedic disease, but it's one that feeding can have an influence on, and we want to reduce the wastage due to that topic. All
right. Peter, the information you've given us on breeding horses just today has been very good. And if you can come back and talk, as you say, it's just almost opens up not a can of worms, but, you start to go down one area, and I'm sure you can just keep going down and down and down and giving us lots more information.
And that's where our Equinews website, the equinews.com website's got a massive information with a heap of articles about all aspects of feeding the breeding horse, and the newsletter that comes out, fortnightly newsletter, which you can sign up for, will often have topics related to breeding. So go to Equinews. It's got nutrition, it's got health, it's got reproduction, it's got some management stuff. Sign up for the newsletter and you'll have a great source of information. If you want specific advice about your horses, then we've got a advice line, 1-800-772-198 or advice@kr.com, and that will give you good information about feeding your mares and young horses for sort of optimum fertility and optimum growth.
Perfect. All right, and those details, just in case you didn't jot them down, will be on horsechats.com, and go there and search for Peter or search for Huntington. All right, Peter, thank you for talking to us today again, and looking forward to the next one and some more tips on feeding horses and equine nutrition. Thank you.
Great, Glenys. Glad to be with you. Okay. Bye.
Now, if you're still there, you probably know that I'm absolutely passionate about education within the horse industry. That's why I host this podcast. My other venture is Online Horse College. Have a look now at onlinehorsecollege.com, and I'll see you over there.
Remember that our comments and instructions are general in nature and do not take into consideration your individual horses or your individual ability and circumstances. If you enjoyed this podcast, then please leave your comment below.